The Picts, the painted people of Scotland, who left stones nobody can read and then disappeared into a word we barely know. They painted themselves blue. They built towers of dry stones so precisely fitted that mortar was unnecessary. They carved enormous standing stones covered in symbols: fish, eagles, bears, serpents, geometric designs that appear nowhere else in the ancient world, and left them standing in fields across northern Scotland without explaining what any of it meant. Roman armies built a wall across Britain specifically to keep them out, and when the empire collapsed, the Picts were still there, exactly where they had been. They fought the Northumbrians to a standstill and won the battle that ensured Scotland would never become English. And then, sometime around 900 AD, they simply stopped being Picts. No conquest, no plague, no catastrophic military defeat. They just gradually became Scots, and their language, which we can see written on those standing stones in symbols nobody has fully decoded, vanished so completely that we don't know how to pronounce a single word of it. How do you stay mysterious for 600 years and then disappear without even leaving an explanation? The first written record of the Picts comes from a Roman panegyric composed in 297 AD, in which the orator Eumenius makes a brief reference to the Caledonians and the Picti as peoples who were apparently giving trouble to the Roman province of Britannia. The word Picti has generated debate among scholars since it was first used. The obvious Latin interpretation, derived from pictus, meaning painted, would suggest that the name referred to their practice of body painting or tattooing. Alternative interpretations have proposed that it might be a Latinization of their own name for themselves, or a term with a different root meaning altogether. The debate has not been resolved, and the Picts themselves left no document explaining what they called themselves or why. What the name captured, whatever its origin, was something that the Romans found striking enough to record. These were people who marked their bodies in ways that made them visually distinctive. Body painting and tattooing were not unusual practices in the Iron Age world, but the specific forms used by the Picts, the animal symbols and geometric designs that appear on their carved stones and that classical authors describe on their bodies, were apparently distinctive enough to define them in Roman perception. The territory where the Picts lived, the northern third of Britain, what is now Scotland roughly north of the Forth Clyde line, was the part of the island that Roman military forces never permanently occupied. Hadrian's Wall, built in the 120s AD across northern England, defined the practical limit of effective Roman control. The Antonine Wall, built further north across the Scottish Central Belt in the 140s, represented a brief attempt at extending that limit that was abandoned within a generation. North of those walls, the Roman Empire observed, traded with, occasionally fought, and ultimately failed to subdue the peoples of northern Britain, of whom the Picts were the most consistently referenced. The physical environment that shaped Pictish culture was one of the most demanding in northern Europe. The highland landscape of northern Scotland, the exposed moorland, the steep glens, the coastline battered by Atlantic weather systems, arriving with nothing to slow them between Iceland and the Scottish shore, imposed specific conditions on everyone who tried to live in it. The growing season was short, the soil thin over bedrock in many areas, the rainfall high, the temperature in the kind of persistent grey cold that distinguishes the Scottish climate from the more dramatic but briefer cold of continental winters. Living in this landscape required specific adaptations in housing, agriculture, animal husbandry, and clothing that the Picts had developed over the centuries before they appear in the historical record. The souterrain, the underground stone-lined passage or chamber that appears at Pictish settlement sites across northern Scotland, is one of the most characteristic features of Pictish domestic architecture, and its purpose has been debated almost as extensively as the stone symbol system. The most functional explanation is storage. A stone-lined underground chamber maintains a temperature of approximately 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, regardless of surface temperature, which makes it ideal for storing dairy products, preserved meat, and root vegetables through a climate where surface storage in summer heat might accelerate spoilage, and surface storage in winter might freeze and destroy the same goods. Living in a landscape where preserving your food supply through winter was not a luxury but a survival requirement, having a reliable cold storage facility was a genuine practical advantage. The souterrain tradition that the Picts inherited from the Iron Age and continued through the early historic period represents a level of practical engineering sophistication that the documentary silence around the Picts tends to obscure. Communities that could organize the quarrying, transport, and precise fitting of thousands of stone slabs into functional underground structures were communities with real technical knowledge and real collective organizational capacity, whatever else we do or don't know about them. The blue coloring that gave the Picts their Roman name came from woad, Isatis tinctoria, a plant in the Brassica family that produces a blue dye when its leaves are processed through a specific fermentation sequence. Growing woad in the Scottish climate was possible, but required specific conditions. The plant needs adequate sunlight during its growing season, and northern Scotland's latitude makes sunlight a scarce resource for significant portions of the year. The woad that the Picts used may have been grown locally in sheltered southern-facing plots, or obtained through trade with more southerly communities where growing conditions were more reliable. The processing of woad leaves into usable dye paste was an industrial operation with a distinctly unpleasant sensory profile. The leaves had to be harvested, dried, crushed, wetted, and then allowed to ferment for an extended period, a process that produced the specific smell of brassica fermentation mixed with the ammonia of the bacterial breakdown, a combination that has been described by modern dye workers attempting to replicate the ancient process as genuinely offensive and persistent. The finished woad paste was also not the concentrated bright blue of modern industrial dye. The colour produced on skin was more of a greyish blue, stronger in direct application and fading over days. The woad dye tradition of the British Isles survived the Roman period and the medieval period as an important textile industry. The dye works of medieval Britain were processing woad for blue textiles until the introduction of indigo from tropical sources disrupted the trade in the 16th century. So the plant that gave the Picts their name continued to colour British cloth for a millennium after the last Pict had stopped painting their skin with it. Whether the body marking of the Picts was paint applied and periodically renewed, or permanent tattooing, is a question that the sources don't definitively answer. Classical writers use the Latin word pictus, painted, which suggests surface application, but the practice of permanent tattooing was known in the ancient world, and the symbol system visible on Pictish stones would have had specific meaning that might have warranted permanent marking. The two practices need not be mutually exclusive. Some marks might have been painted for specific occasions, while others were permanently tattooed as identity markers. The symbols that appear on the carved standing stones, the crescent and V-rod, the double disc and Z-rod, the mirror and comb, the various animal designs, have the quality of a systematic symbol set rather than random decorative choices. The same symbols appear consistently across a geographic range spanning several hundred kilometers, carved by different hands in different periods, suggesting that the symbol system had a shared meaning across the Pictish cultural world, rather than being a local or individual invention. Whether those meanings were linguistic, a form of writing, or non-linguistic, clan markers, religious symbols, occupational designations, is the central, unresolved question of Pictish studies. The tattooing that marked a Pictish warrior's identity was not accomplished quickly or painlessly. Ancient and traditional tattooing methods, pricking the skin with a sharp implement and introducing pigment, or cutting the skin and rubbing pigment into the wound, are effective but time-consuming for complex designs. And the designs visible on Pictish stones, if they were being replicated on human bodies, would have required extended and repeated sessions. The healing process following tattooing is a period of itching, scabbing, an immune response that lasts weeks, and in a population without access to antiseptic treatment, infected tattoo sites were a genuine health risk. The permanence of the resulting marks reflected both the significance of what they communicated and the cost of having them created. The wheelhouse, the distinctive circular stone structure that appears across the western and northern Scottish islands as one of the characteristic building forms of the Iron Age and early historic period, took its name from the arrangement of internal radial stone piers that divided the interior space into compartments around a central hearth, like the spokes of a wheel around a hub. The structure was not invented by the Picts specifically. It has predecessors in the Atlantic Scottish Iron Age tradition that predates the Pictish historical period, but it represents the building tradition within which many Picts lived, and its physical characteristics shaped daily life in specific and documentable ways. The walls of a well-built wheelhouse were genuinely massive, stone construction 2 to 3 meters thick in some examples, creating a thermal buffer of such effectiveness that the interior temperature remained significantly warmer than the exterior, even in the worst highland winter conditions. The cost of this thermal performance was the weight of the construction, requiring significant organized labor to quarry, transport, and assemble the stone, and the dark, cave-like quality of an interior where the tiny apertures required for ventilation and the thick walls that blocked external light combined to produce an environment that was dim even at midday. The central hearth that heated the wheelhouse and cooked the food produced smoke that had to go somewhere. In a well-constructed wheelhouse, the smoke rose to the apex of the conical thatched roof and escaped through a gap at the top, with the thermal dynamics of the fire pulling the smoke upward and through. In less well-constructed examples, or when weather conditions created downdrafts that reversed the normal smoke circulation, the smoke distributed itself through the interior instead, filling the living space with a haze that the inhabitants breathed continuously and that accumulated as soot on every surface, including the thatch. The exposure to wood smoke that this represented was a chronic respiratory irritant, and the skeletal evidence from populations living in similar environments consistently shows respiratory pathology. The arrangement of sleeping areas in a wheelhouse was determined by the distribution of heat. The warmest positions were those closest to the central hearth, and the social hierarchy of the household was expressed in who slept where relative to the fire. The stone-lined compartments around the interior perimeter were sleeping and storage spaces, lined with whatever organic bedding material was available: bracken fern, dried heather, straw, that required periodic replacement as it accumulated the biological residues of occupation. The animals that shared the building or the immediately adjacent space in winter were not an intrusion, but a deliberate management strategy. A goat or sheep confined in the same building as a human family through a Scottish winter added significant body heat to the interior environment, a living heat source that needed no additional fuel. It also contributed the specific smells of animal occupation to the existing mixture of smoke, body heat, and whatever food preparation had most recently occurred. The boundary between human and animal space in this context was practical rather than categorical, and the resulting environment was one that modern visitors to reconstructed Iron Age buildings find strongly atmospheric in ways that the people who actually lived there probably did not notice. The thermal efficiency of the wheelhouse design was recognized by the communities that built them as a genuine practical advantage in a climate where survival through winter was a real rather than theoretical concern. And the architectural tradition represents the accumulated knowledge of generations of builders who had experimented with what worked and retained the design features that the experience of Highland winters had validated. The Pictish symbol stones are among the most intriguing archaeological artifacts in Britain, and their intractability has kept scholars occupied for well over a century without producing consensus on their most basic interpretive questions. Approximately 250 stones have been identified that bear the distinctive Pictish symbol system, distributed across a geographic area roughly corresponding to the historical Pictish territory north of the Forth and south of the Moray Firth, with concentrations in Aberdeenshire, Angus and the Black Isle. They range from small, unshaped boulders to large dressed slabs, and from simple single-symbol incisions to elaborate compositions combining multiple symbols with detailed representational imagery. The symbol system itself consists of approximately 30 recurring symbols, each appearing in multiple examples across different stones and different regions, suggesting that the symbols were understood consistently across the Pictish cultural world. The most common include the crescent with a V-rod overlying it, the double disc with a Z-rod, the mirror and comb combination, the Pictish beast, a fantastic animal that resembles an elephant or dolphin in some interpretations, and a stylized horse or bovine in others, and a series of recognizable animals, including eagles, salmon, boars, deer, and bulls. The animal representations are executed with a naturalistic quality that is among the finest wildlife art of the early medieval period anywhere in Europe. The carvers who produced these stones worked in conditions that do not simplify any aspect of stone carving. Scottish sandstone and granite are the primary materials, each requiring different tools and techniques. Sandstone can be cut with iron tools and worked with incised lines, while granite requires pecking and abrasion rather than cutting. The outdoor conditions in which most of this work was done, given the scale of the stones and their evident placement in landscape contexts, involved the exposure to weather that working outdoors in northern Scotland always involves. The cold that stiffens hands and makes fine motor control difficult. The rain that washes away the chalk or charcoal marks used to guide the carving. The short working days of winter months. The Class II stones, a scholarly classification that distinguishes the later stones with Christian crosses from the earlier pre-Christian symbol-only stones, show the Pictish symbol system integrated with Christian iconography in ways that document a transitional period rather than a clean break. The cross takes the visual center of the composition, but the Pictish symbols remain, arranged around the cross, in positions that suggest they retained meaning and significance within the Christian context, rather than being simply preserved as decoration. A stone at Meagle in Perthshire shows a scene that is interpreted as Daniel in the lion's den, alongside Pictish symbols, and an elaborate hunting scene. The biblical narrative translated into a visual vocabulary that includes both Christian and indigenous Pictish elements. The meaning of the symbol system remains genuinely unknown after decades of scholarly effort. The most extensively developed hypothesis, that the symbols are a heraldic or genealogical system recording family identities or marriage alliances, is supported by the observation that symbols often appear in pairs on individual stones, and that the same pairings recur across different examples, suggesting a systematic rather than random combination logic. But this hypothesis, while plausible, cannot be verified against any documentary evidence. The dietary reconstruction of the Pictish population comes from multiple lines of evidence. The isotopic analysis of human skeletal remains, the food residues preserved in cooking vessels and in the anaerobic deposits of waterlogged sites, the animal bones from settlement middens that document which species were consumed and in what proportions, and the direct evidence of dental wear that records what people chewed across their lifetimes. Together, these sources paint a picture of a diet that was adequate for the physical demands of an active life in a cold climate, limited in variety by the productive capacity of the highland landscape, and hard on teeth in the specific ways that stone-ground grain diets always are. Barley was the dominant cereal crop across most of the Pictish territory, chosen for its ability to grow in the cool, wet conditions of northern Scotland, where wheat was too variable to depend on. Oats, which were native to the region as a weed of cultivation before being selectively grown as a crop, were also significant. Both were ground between stone querns to produce a flour that, however carefully milled, contained fine particles of grit from the grinding stones that accumulated in the finished product and created a dietary abrasive with long-term consequences for the teeth of everyone who ate it. The specific pattern of dental wear visible in Pictish skeletal remains, the enamel surface worn away evenly from the grinding surfaces of the molars, sometimes to the point where the dentine is exposed and pain from temperature sensitivity becomes constant, is the direct physical record of a lifetime of eating stone-ground grain. The animal protein component of the Pictish diet came from several sources. Cattle were kept primarily for dairy production, the milk, cheese, and fermented dairy products that provided the fat and protein that grain alone could not supply, with meat from cattle reserved for older animals, slaughter at the end of the grazing season or special occasions. Sheep were kept for wool, secondary dairy production, and meat. Pigs, which efficiently convert food scraps and woodland forage into protein and fat, appear in the faunal remains from Pictish sites, in proportions that vary by location and period, but generally indicate a regular contribution to the diet. Fish, from both freshwater and coastal sources, depending on location, supplemented the diet seasonally, and the coastal Pictish communities had access to marine species whose nutritional profile, particularly in terms of omega-3 fatty acids and iodine, would have been a significant advantage. The heather ale tradition that survived in Scottish folk memory as a story about a recipe that was never revealed, supposedly carried to the grave by the last Pict, rather than shared with the Scottish king, captures something of the specific combination of real cultural knowledge and deliberate withholding that makes the Pictish world feel simultaneously close and permanently inaccessible. Whether the story is true or not, it describes a civilization that chose what to share and what to keep, and kept more than it shared. The fermented drinks that the Picts consumed were produced from grain and from the wild products of the landscape. Heather ale, a fermented drink made from young heather tips combined with grain, is documented in Scottish tradition, and the chemical analysis of residues in Bronze Age pottery from Scotland has confirmed heather as an ingredient in ancient fermented beverages. Mead, from the wild honey that could be extracted from the bee colonies that occupied the Highland woodland, was available seasonally. These drinks were fermented to low alcohol contents, rather than the high concentrations of distilled spirits, functioning more as preserved liquid nutrition than as primarily intoxicating beverages. Hadrian's Wall, stretching 73 miles across the width of northern England, from the Solway Firth to the River Tyne, was built beginning in 122 AD as the permanent northern frontier of the Roman Empire in Britain. It was not, as popular imagination sometimes suggests, a barrier against invasion. It was too long and too lightly garrisoned to prevent any determined force from crossing it. It was instead a controlled border, equipped with gateways at regular intervals, designed to manage movement rather than prevent it, and to project the administrative authority of Rome over the landscape north of it, without maintaining the permanent military occupation that would have required far more resources than Rome chose to invest in the distant northwest. The peoples north of the wall, including those who would eventually be collectively called Picts, had a complex relationship with the Roman presence to their south that combined resistance with trade, raiding with economic integration, and political hostility with the adoption of specific Roman material goods that the exchange relationship made available. The Roman military records and archaeological evidence from the wall zone document a pattern of repeated raiding from the north that required periodic military response, alternating with periods of relative stability that the Romans maintained through a combination of military deterrence, payments to northern leaders whose cooperation was worth purchasing, and the managed trade that the wall's gateway system facilitated. What the northern peoples took from Roman Britain, and the archaeological evidence from Pictish period sites shows they took Roman goods, was primarily metal. Coins melted down for the silver or bronze, iron tools and weapons whose quality exceeded what the northern smiths could produce, and the occasional prestige object that circulated through the gift exchange economy of the aristocratic class. What they gave in return was less well documented. Animal products, slaves taken in raiding, and possibly specific local resources whose value in Roman commerce is harder to trace archaeologically. The experience of the Roman frontier from the northern side would have been a specific combination of awareness, wariness, and opportunity. The wall was visible, its garrisons were known in their general disposition, and the communities within raiding range of it were communities that understood the Roman military response capacity from experience and planned accordingly. Night raids in conditions of poor visibility, the fog and darkness that the Scottish climate reliably provided, reduced the Roman ability to mount effective pursuit. The terrain north of the wall, with its bogs and hills and the intimate local knowledge that the attacking raiders possessed and the Roman garrison generally did not, further degraded Roman response effectiveness. The Romans' inability to permanently pacify northern Britain was not for lack of military capability and principle. Several Roman commanders mounted successful campaigns deep into Scotland, reaching as far north as the Moray Firth and the Orkney Islands. The problem was not winning the battles, but sustaining the occupation afterward in terrain and climate conditions that made permanent garrisoning expensive and logistically demanding. The Picts, who survived Roman military expeditions by retreating into landscape that Roman logistics couldn't sustain operations in, were deploying exactly the same geographic patience that would serve them in future conflicts: the capacity to outlast any force that had to be supplied from outside. The Pictish succession system has fascinated and puzzled historians since the Venerable Bede noted in the early 8th century that when the Picts needed a king and there was doubt about the succession, they chose from the female line rather than the male. This observation, combined with the analysis of the king lists that survive from the Pictish period, has produced an ongoing scholarly debate about whether the Picts practiced genuine matrilineal succession, a system in which royal identity and inheritance passed through the mother rather than the father, and if so, what this meant for the social organization of Pictish communities more broadly. The evidence is genuinely unusual. Analysis of the Pictish king lists shows a pattern of brother succeeding brother, then cousin succeeding cousin, in ways that are inconsistent with straightforward patrilineal descent from a common father, but consistent with a system where the relevant common ancestor was traced through the female line. If kingship passed through women, specifically if a man's claim to rule came through his mother rather than his father, then the sons of different fathers but the same mother would share a claim that sons of the same father but different mothers would not. The practical social implications of such a system, if it existed, would have been significant. In a patrilineal system, the identity of the father determines the child's social position, which creates strong incentives to control women's reproductive behavior and to maintain certainty about paternity. In a matrilineal system, the identity of the mother is the relevant fact, which shifts the social emphasis in ways that classical and early medieval observers from patrilineal cultures found confusing or transgressive. The apparent freedom of Pictish women in their marriage arrangements, which Roman and later sources comment on with varying degrees of disapproval, may reflect a social system in which female lineage was the organizing principle of inheritance rather than an absence of social structure. The archaeology of Pictish elite burial provides some support for the idea that Pictish women occupied unusual social positions. Several high-status burials identified as female by skeletal analysis contain grave goods, weapons, personal ornaments of considerable quality, objects associated with social authority, that in the patrilineal Germanic cultures of the same period would be exclusively associated with male burials. Whether these represent women of unusual individual status within a conventional patrilineal society, or represent the expected grave goods of women whose social position was normally elevated, is a question the archaeological evidence alone cannot answer. The matrilineal elements visible in Pictish succession practice, whatever their exact form, represent a social organization that distinguished the Picts from most of their contemporaries, and that made sense within the specific social and economic conditions of the Atlantic Celtic world, a world in which the practical importance of stable community identity through women's networks and the specific vulnerability of patrilineal succession to the chronic male mortality of a warrior society may have made alternative inheritance systems genuinely functional. The wedding ceremonies that Pictish tradition would have involved, conducted at natural landmarks, possibly involving the sharing of water from sacred sources, the exchange of pledges witnessed by the community, are not documented in any direct surviving source, and must be reconstructed from the comparative evidence of related Celtic traditions and the indirect evidence of later Scottish folk practice. What the landscape evidence suggests is that outdoor ritual sites at water sources and sacred hills were the venues for the communal ceremonies that marked the transitions of the social year, and that the construction of social identity through ritual, including marriage, was conducted in relationship to the natural landscape rather than in dedicated built structures. The religious practice of the pre-Christian Picts is, like most things about them, known primarily through archaeological evidence rather than documentary sources, and the interpretation of that evidence is constrained by the absence of the contextualizing texts that would allow confident identification of specific beliefs and practices. What the archaeology provides is the physical record of specific behaviors, the patterns of deposition, construction, and landscape modification that religious practice produces, from which the general character of Pictish religious life can be partially reconstructed. The sacred spring and sacred water source that appear consistently in the religious practice of Celtic peoples across northern and western Europe have a specific archaeological signature. Concentrations of deliberately deposited objects in and around water sources that have no functional explanation except ritual. The pattern of metalwork deposition in Scottish locks, bronze and silver objects, including items of obvious high value, found in locations where accidental loss is implausible, documents the practice of votive offering to water sources that the Celtic religious tradition shared with many other ancient religions. The specific objects deposited in Scottish waters during the Pictish period include some of the finest metalwork that Pictish craftspeople produced. The Norreys Law hoard, discovered in Fife in the 19th century, contains silver objects decorated with Pictish symbols that represent among the highest quality of Pictish craft production. Objects that had obvious social and economic value and were deliberately removed from circulation by placement in a context from which recovery was not intended. The theological logic of depositing valuable objects, the exchange of human-produced value for divine favor, or the discharge of a vow made in a moment of need, is the same logic that drove similar practices across the ancient world. The sacred tree, the specific large or unusually shaped individual trees that Celtic religious tradition recognized as sites of divine presence, appears in later Scottish folk tradition in ways that probably preserve elements of pre-Christian practice. Wells associated with specific trees, the tying of strips of cloth to branches at sacred locations, the avoidance of cutting certain trees, These practices persisted in Scottish rural communities into the modern period and represent the most direct documentary evidence of the religious attitudes toward the natural world that predated Christianity in the region. The seasonal rituals that marked the agricultural year for the Picts, the observances at the solstices and equinoxes, the ceremonies associated with the beginning and end of the grazing season, the communal gatherings that combined practical business with religious observance, are the least documented aspect of Pictish religious life, precisely because they were the most ordinary, the most embedded in daily life, and the least likely to produce the kind of unusual or anomalous archaeological deposits that tend to attract scholarly attention. The archaeological signature of routine religious practice is, by its nature, the absence of extraordinary deposits. The pile of animal bones from a solstice feast looks similar to the bones from any other large meal. The worn path to a sacred spring looks similar to any other frequently used track. And the specific meaning of these ordinary landscape features requires documentary context to decode that the Pictish world simply did not leave. The ordinary religion of ordinary people, conducted in the course of the ordinary year, leaves a thinner archaeological trace than the extraordinary votive depositions of high-value objects. The Battle of Dun Nechtain, fought on May 20th, 685 AD, at a location in Angus that modern scholars identify with a site near Forfar, was one of the most consequential engagements in the history of early medieval Britain, and it is also one of the least known by the general public. Its obscurity is itself historically significant. It was a Pictish victory, and Pictish victories tend to be less thoroughly remembered in the historical tradition than the defeats of the same period. The background to the battle was the aggressive expansion of the Northumbrian kingdom, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom that controlled northeastern England and had been extending its influence northward into southern Scotland for several decades. Northumbria under King Ecgfrith had reached a position of military and political dominance in northern Britain that made it the most powerful entity in the region. And the Pictish kingdoms north of the Forth Tay line were among the communities whose independence was increasingly constrained by Northumbrian pressure. Bridie mac Billy, the Pictish king who confronted Ecgfrith at Dun Nechtain, was a man about whom the sources tell us relatively little, the frustrating standard condition for significant actors in Pictish history. What the sources document is the outcome of the engagement he organised. Ecgfrith, pursuing a Pictish force into terrain he didn't know, was led into an ambush in conditions that maximised the Pictish advantage and minimised Northumbria's. The Northumbrian army was destroyed. Ecgfrith was killed. The Northumbrian military expansion into what is now Scotland stopped at the point it had reached on May 19th, 685 AD, and never resumed. The significance of Dun Nechtain extends beyond the immediate military outcome. It demonstrated that the Pictish kingdoms had the organisational capacity to plan and execute a complex military operation against the most powerful military force in northern Britain, and it established the precedent that the northern limit of Anglian territorial ambition was somewhere south of the Highland line, rather than wherever military success might push it. The specific detail of how the ambush was arranged, whether the apparent Pictish retreat that drew Ecgfrith forward was planned from the beginning, or was a tactical improvisation during the engagement, is not recoverable from the sources. What is clear is that the Northumbrian force was moving through terrain that it did not know well, following a retreating force whose knowledge of the landscape was intimate, and that this combination produced the outcome. The bogs and wetlands that characterise parts of the Angus landscape would have provided both the specific hazard that waterlogged ground presents to an army in movement, and the channels through which a force with local knowledge could manoeuvre, while a force without it could not. The political consequence of the battle was the contraction of Northumbrian power back to its pre-expansion boundaries, and the stabilisation of a frontier roughly corresponding to the later Scottish border. The lands that Northumbria had taken from Pictish control were not immediately recovered, but the dynamic of continued northward expansion was broken permanently. Bede, writing in Northumbria 40 years after the battle, described it as a catastrophe whose effects were still being felt in his own time. The Picts recovering their own lands, the Irish Scots recovering theirs, and the Britons of the north reasserting independence that had been under Northumbrian pressure. The Irish monk Columba, Colm Kill in Gaelic, meaning dove of the church, arrived on the island of Iona off the southwest coast of Scotland in 563 AD and established the monastery that would become one of the most important religious and intellectual centres in early medieval Europe. His mission included the evangelization of the Pictish kingdoms and the life of Columba, written by Adamnan of Iona approximately a century after the saint's death, provides the most detailed account available of early Christian contact with the Picts and of the Pictish world in the late 6th century. The life of Columba is not a historical document in the modern sense. It is a hagiography structured around the demonstration of Columba's sanctity through accounts of miracles, prophetic visions, and divine interventions that conform to the conventions of the genre. The specific details it provides about the Pictish environment, however, have the texture of genuine observation. The landscape, the weather, the social arrangements of the communities Columba moved through are described with a specificity that suggests access to real knowledge, even when the miraculous framework around them is conventional. The account of the encounter with the water beast in the River Ness, typically cited as the earliest recorded sighting of a Loch Ness monster, though the text describes a creature in the river rather than the loch, has the specific character of a hagiographic monster confrontation episode. A terrifying creature threatening a human is driven back by the saint's command in a demonstration of spiritual authority over the natural world. Whether this account reflects a genuine, unusual encounter with some large animal, a conventional hagiographic episode with no specific physical referent, or something in between, is a question that the text itself cannot answer, and that later enthusiasm for the Loch Ness monster as a separate question has made more rather than less difficult to assess. The monasteries that Columba's mission established in Pictish territory were small by later standards. Communities of perhaps a dozen to several dozen monks living in timber and wattle buildings within an enclosure, dependent on their own agricultural labour and the support of the local aristocracy who patronized them. The intellectual and liturgical culture these monasteries brought was entirely unfamiliar to the Pictish communities around them. Latin literacy, a textual tradition with no connection to the oral knowledge systems that the Druids had maintained. Architectural and artistic traditions from Ireland and the broader Christian Mediterranean world. The adoption of Christianity by the Pictish aristocracy, which appears to have been substantially complete by the 7th century, though the process was gradual, changed the material culture of Pictish expression more visibly than it changed most other aspects of daily life. The Class II Pictish stones, with their integration of Christian crosses with the indigenous symbol system, document the specifically Pictish synthesis of the two traditions. Neither a simple replacement of one by the other, nor a pure continuation of the older forms, but something that combined them in ways that reflected the specific social and religious dynamics of the conversion period. The monks who produced the elaborately decorated manuscripts of the insular tradition in the 7th and 8th centuries were men whose hands had been trained in the same visual culture that produced the Pictish symbol stones, and the interlace and zoomorphic decoration of the Book of Kells can be read as the Latin artistic tradition of the Celtic world, finding expression within a Christian theological framework, a synthesis that the Pictish symbol stones, with their integration of indigenous symbols and Christian crosses, had already anticipated. The Norse raids on the British Isles that began with the attack on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 AD reached the Pictish coastline within years and continued with increasing frequency and intensity through the 9th century, creating a sustained period of external pressure that contributed to the political changes that would eventually transform the Pictish kingdoms into the Kingdom of Scotland. The Viking impact on Pictish territory operated through several mechanisms: direct raiding of coastal settlements and monasteries, the colonization of island territory that displaced Pictish communities, and the political pressure that the Norse presence along the northern and western coasts placed on the internal dynamics of the Pictish kingdoms. The Broke Towers, the remarkable circular dry stone structures of the Scottish Iron Age that reached heights of up to 13 metres with walls several metres thick, had largely ceased to be primary residences by the time the Norse raids began, having been built centuries earlier as defensive structures in the context of earlier inter-community violence. Some were reoccupied during the Viking period as refuges, and the archaeological evidence from some Broke sites shows deposits from this secondary occupation phase. The structural durability of the Brokes, their walls were still standing after 2 millennia of weathering when archaeologists began studying them, meant that they retained practical defensive utility long after they had been abandoned as primary settlements. The monastic communities that had been established on islands and coastal promontories by the Columban mission were particularly vulnerable to Norse raiding. The specific combination of isolation that made these sites spiritually desirable, the sea crossing that separated the monastery from the mainland, the removal from secular life, made them difficult to defend and easy to approach by sea. The Iona monastery, Columba's foundation, was raided in 795, 802, 806, and 825 AD. After the 806 attack, in which 68 members of the community were killed, much of the community relocated to Kells in Ireland, taking the manuscripts and relics that were the primary cultural wealth of the foundation. The relationship between the Norse raids and the end of Iona's position as the primary centre of Columban Christianity is direct. The Norse settlements that developed in the northern and western islands of Scotland, Orkney, Shetland, the Hebrides, represented a permanent territorial change that removed significant island territory from Pictish cultural and political reach. The Pictish populations of these islands were absorbed into the Norse communities rather than eliminated, and the genetic evidence of modern Orcadians shows the Scandinavian contribution to the island population clearly. But the cultural and linguistic transition was toward Norse rather than Pictish cultural norms, and the distinctly Pictish material culture of the pre-Norse islands was replaced by Norse forms within a generation or two of intensive Norse settlement. The specific character of the Norse impact varied significantly between the northern islands, where Norse settlement was most complete and Pictish cultural continuity most thoroughly disrupted, and the mainland areas, where Norse raiding created political instability without necessarily producing the demographic replacement that occurred in Orkney and Shetland. The Pictish kingdoms of the mainland had to absorb both the direct losses from raiding and the indirect political consequences of Norse colonization of their peripheral territories. The physical evidence of Pictish health and disease comes primarily from the skeletal remains recovered from burials across the Pictish territory, supplemented by the occasional preserved organic material from waterlogged contexts. The picture that emerges is consistent with what the material conditions of life in the early medieval Scottish highlands would predict: a population experiencing high childhood mortality, significant occupational injury in adulthood, chronic dental pathology from dietary abrasives, and the specific bone diseases associated with nutritional deficiencies in a climate with limited sunlight exposure. Vitamin D deficiency, rickets in children, osteomalacia in adults, is a predictable consequence of life at high latitudes, where the ultraviolet radiation required for vitamin D synthesis in the skin is insufficient for significant portions of the year. The traditional Scottish diet, with its fish consumption, provided some vitamin D from dietary sources, and the populations with good coastal access to oily fish would have had better vitamin D status than inland agricultural communities. The skeletal evidence from inland Pictish burial sites shows a higher incidence of bone pathology consistent with vitamin D deficiency than coastal sites, a pattern that reflects the real dietary variation between communities at different distances from the sea. The injuries that Pictish life produced are documented in healed bone trauma visible in the skeleton. Fractures of the forearm, the classic defensive injury produced when a person raises their arm to block a blow, appear in Pictish male skeletal remains at rates that suggest involvement in interpersonal violence was common enough to constitute an occupational hazard rather than an occasional accident. The healed fractures indicate survival of the initial injury, but the quality of the healing, the degree of misalignment and shortening visible in the healed bone, reflects the treatment available, splinting and immobilization with whatever materials were at hand, without the reduction and stabilization techniques of later surgery. Dental disease was near universal. The combination of the abrasive stone-ground grain diet, the consumption of fermented dairy products with high lactic acid content, and the absence of any effective dental hygiene practice produced a trajectory of dental deterioration that began in childhood and progressed through adulthood to the near-complete loss of the posterior dentition by middle age in many individuals. The pain associated with dental decay progressing to pulp exposure, the specific sharp pain of nerve exposure that modern dental anesthesia has made a controllable experience, was a chronic feature of adult Pictish life for which no effective treatment existed. The specific irony of the willow bark remedy, that the Picts had access to a plant containing the precursor compound to aspirin, captures something important about the relationship between traditional medicine and the conditions it addressed. The empirical knowledge of what helped had been accumulated without the chemical understanding of why it helped, and both the knowledge and its limits were passed on through the same oral tradition that transmitted everything else the Picts knew. The bark preparations used for pain management, willow bark, whose active compound is the precursor to aspirin, provided some relief, but not the targeted numbing of modern dental anesthesia. Kenneth MacAlpin, Shinard MacAlpin in Gaelic, is traditionally credited with uniting the Pictish kingdom and the kingdom of Dalriata, the Irish Scots of Western Scotland, into what would become the Kingdom of Scotland, and with being the first king of Scots in the dynastic tradition that would eventually produce the Scottish monarchy. The reality of his reign, as far as the sources allow its reconstruction, is considerably more complicated and contested than the traditional founding narrative suggests. Kenneth's father Eilpin appears in both Pictish and Scottish king lists, which suggests connections to both the Pictish and Gaelic aristocratic traditions. Kenneth's own claim to the Pictish kingship, if he had one, may have come through the matrilineal succession principle that Pictish practice may have used, with a Pictish princess as his mother or grandmother. Alternatively, his takeover of Pictish territory may have been straightforwardly military, achieved in the context of the Norse pressure on both kingdoms that made cooperation or absorption more practical than continued competition. The later Scottish tradition preserves a story of Kenneth inviting the Pictish nobles to a feast and massacring them while they were drunk, a founding murder narrative that has the specific quality of politically motivated retrospective storytelling, providing a dramatic explanation for a transition that was probably more gradual and complicated than a single violent event. The story may preserve some memory of genuine political violence during the transition period, or it may be entirely invented to explain why the Pictish aristocracy disappeared from the record without leaving documentary evidence of resistance to the transition. What is clear is that after approximately 843 AD, the term Pict disappears from the historical sources with remarkable speed. The people who had been called Picts continue to exist. The population of northern Scotland was not replaced, but they are now described differently, as subjects of the Kingdom of Alba, as Scots, eventually as Scots. The political entity that replaced the Pictish kingdoms used Gaelic as its administrative and literary language, rather than whatever language the Picts had spoken. And this linguistic shift meant that the documentary tradition going forward was built on Gaelic rather than Pictish foundations. The specific experience of linguistic and cultural transition for the ordinary Pictish-speaking population was probably gradual rather than sudden. The shift of official language in the court and church would have spread downward through the social hierarchy over generations, with the oldest Pictish-speaking communities in the most remote areas maintaining the language longest after it had been abandoned in the administrative centre. The transition that replaced Pictish with Gaelic in the 9th and 10th centuries was not the first time Scotland had experienced a major language shift. The pre-Pictish population had already undergone at least one such transition in prehistoric times, and it would not be the last. The specific trajectory of Pictish cultural absorption into the Gaelic-speaking kingdom of Alba, the way that a dominant administrative and literary language spreads downward through a society over generations, progressively displacing the languages spoken in private and domestic contexts, is a process that has been repeated in many other contexts across history, and whose outcome is always the same. The language that has no institutional support eventually loses the community of speakers that would otherwise sustain it. Pictish is classified by modern linguists as a language isolate within the broader context of the Celtic language family, potentially related to the Brittonic Celtic languages of Britain, but sufficiently distinct that the relationship is contested and the language cannot be translated using knowledge of Welsh, Cornish, or Breton alone. The evidence for Pictish as a language comes from two sources: the Ogham inscriptions on a small number of stones that are identified as Pictish by their archaeological and geographic context, and the place names and personal names preserved in Latin documents from the period. The Ogham alphabet, a writing system using a series of notched lines cut across or along the edge of a standing stone, was developed in Ireland in approximately the 4th century AD and used primarily for memorial inscriptions. Its adoption by the Picts, who had their own symbol system but apparently used Ogham specifically for phonetic representation of language, suggests that Pictish required a phonetic writing system for some purposes that the symbol system either couldn't serve or wasn't used for. The Pictish Ogham inscriptions are typically short, names and formulaic phrases rather than extended texts, and they are in a language that remains imperfectly understood despite the decipherability of the Ogham script itself. The place names that begin with the Pictish element pit, meaning a portion or share of land, survive across the Scottish landscape in names like Pitlochry, Pittenweem, Pittendry, and several dozen others, providing a geographic distribution that maps closely to the historical Pictish territory. This distribution makes the pit names among the most reliable indicators of the Pictish linguistic boundary, and their persistence through the subsequent Gaelic and then English language shifts that have otherwise replaced most Pictish place name evidence suggests that land division terms were among the most stable elements of the naming tradition, even as the language that produced them was replaced. Personal names preserved in king lists and the occasional Latin document provide a small vocabulary of Pictish words that can be partially analysed through comparison with related Celtic languages. Names like Bridie, Nechtain, Talorc, and Uaret recur in the Pictish king lists and have been analysed for their Celtic roots, providing some insight into the linguistic structure of Pictish, while simultaneously confirming how much remains inaccessible. The gap between being able to identify the Celtic roots of individual name elements and being able to read, translate, and speak the language is a gap that the available evidence cannot bridge. The silence of the Pictish language, the specific silence of a tongue for which no grammar, no vocabulary list, no translation key, and no speaker has survived, is one of the more complete silences in the historical record of Northern Europe. Other languages that died in roughly the same period left more traces. Gothic has its Bible, Hunnic has its names and words, Vandalic has its glosses, Pictish has its symbols, which may be language or may not be, and its ogham inscriptions, which are language but too few and too formulaic to unlock the rest. And the wind across the Scottish highlands, which has been blowing over the symbol stones for 1200 years and cannot be asked what they mean. The symbol stones are the most enduring physical evidence of the Pictish civilization, and they are still standing, those that have not been moved to museum collections, in fields, churchyards and roadsides across the landscape of northern and eastern Scotland. Time has done different things to different stones. Some are crisp enough that the carving appears almost fresh. Others have been worn by weather to the point where the symbols are recoverable only through close examination or photographic enhancement that reveals the shallow surviving incisions against the grain of the stone surface. The differential preservation reflects differences in the stone type, the degree of exposure, and the degree of care that each stone's specific history has involved. The stones that ended up in church grounds were often preserved by incorporation into later medieval building projects, used as building material, as grave markers, or simply left standing in a location that their Christian associations made worth maintaining. The stones that stood in open fields were subject to the practical decisions of generations of farmers who needed the land, who might move an inconvenient stone, who might use its carved face as a convenient flat surface, or who might leave it alone because moving multi-ton carved stones is more effort than most agricultural problems require. The survival of the stones in their current distribution is a record of those decisions as much as of the original Pictish choices about where to place them. The scholarly effort to understand the symbols has produced a large and technically impressive body of work, including comprehensive catalogues of every known stone, statistical analyses of symbol co-occurrences, attempts to fit the symbols to known Celtic ogham equivalents, and the application of computational approaches to pattern recognition in the symbol set. None of these approaches has produced a decipherment that the field has accepted as complete, and the current consensus is cautious. The symbols were systematic. They had shared meaning across the Pictish cultural area. They were used to communicate something specific rather than as pure decoration. And what specifically they communicated remains unknown. The Pictish DNA that modern genomic analysis has identified in the populations of northern Scotland, particularly in Orkney and the northeastern mainland, is the biological trace of a population that never left, but whose cultural identity was absorbed by the surrounding world. The Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA signatures that can be attributed with reasonable confidence to the pre-Norse Pictish population show genetic continuity between the early medieval period and the present. The Picts are still there, in a genetic sense, in the people who live where they lived, just no longer distinguished by the cultural and linguistic markers that once made them identifiable as Picts. The landscape is the last thing. The hills and lochs, an Atlantic coastline that determined where the Picts built their hill forts, placed their symbol stones, dug their souterrains, and conducted the ceremonies of their religious and social life, are unchanged in their essential character. The climate that made the Pictish world cold and wet and isolated is still making northern Scotland cold and wet and isolated, still producing the specific quality of light and weather that the stones were carved in, still blowing the cold Atlantic wind across the moorland where the symbol stones stand in their fields, still keeping whatever secrets were carved into them from the people who made them and from the archaeologists, linguists, and historians who have spent the generations since looking for a key that has not yet been found.